Welcome to Between Two Psychs, a podcast where two psychologists and board-approved supervisors deep dive into many of the questions and challenges that provisional psychologists and early career therapists face. Your hosts, Isabelle Tombleson and Claire Trevitt, talk about a range of topics, specifically relating to psychologists and therapists who are just starting out.
We're back.
We are back, and we are now going to be talking about Competency 4 for the new psychological competencies, which is conducts psychological assessments.
Yes, that's right. Thank you so much, Claire, for being prepared and talking about Competency 4 today. Now, Competency 4 is going to be quite familiar to most of you if you've been a psychologist for a while, and especially if you're in the one of the training programs at the moment. It's very similar to the old competencies, and it just talks about how we must conduct psychological assessments and how we do that in an ethical and competent way.
Yes, indeed. So many of us would be familiar with this already. And in terms of our requirements, I think some of it, as we've discussed, Isabelle, is there's a lot of overlap between what we have been required to do and what we are now required to do. One of the things that I'm seeing more and more throughout these competencies is the emphasis on the cultural context and ensuring that we are aware of the strengths and limitations of any kind of tools that we might be using.
That's right. I do appreciate the wording, the way that they've worded this competency, because it is talking about how we as professionals need to continue to keep up our knowledge of the different assessments, both cognitive and otherwise. And that consideration of culture wasn't mentioned in the old version. Let's talk about that for a moment, Claire. So why is it important that we're considering culture when it comes to selection and administration of psychological assessments?
And I guess that most assessments have been validated and based upon particular populations, and that's going to vary. Like some assessments might be applicable across a broader range of cultures, whereas other assessments may focus more on the dominant culture potentially of where the tests may have originated. So I'm thinking about, say, the Wechsler test. I believe that they were originated in America, but are like the Wechsler memory scale, the Wechsler intelligence scale for children, the WISC, the WACE, etc. And these assessments are typically delivered on individuals from a white background. So I don't think that they are particularly relevant to Indigenous children, for example. So I can remember a time many years ago where I was required to administer a WISC to an Aboriginal student who had a support worker attending the assessment, and the support worker actually looked at elements of the assessment and said, that doesn't really assess anything.
Wow.
And I was like, wow, this is the tool I've been given, and this is all I've been given to assess this child. And yet, is this information going to be valid and reliable? I'm talking back in the early 2000s. And at the time, I was a very early career psychologist. I may even have been a provisional psychologist, and this was the first time. And so I just took the information back, but the option I was given was that this is the test that you've been asked to do, and this is what we need you to score, and we need to support this student educationally. But yeah, it really didn't take in that sort of into account, that cultural context. And I think that's really important because we do need to be supporting in Australia, we do need to be supporting a whole range of different students in an educational setting. And so that was just one example in terms of what may or may not be appropriate and culturally appropriate, because sometimes what we are being asked to deliver, and I think these guidelines now give us much more license.
Yeah.
but also there's more of a requirement and an onus on us and also on supervisors to be able to say, okay, that's a fair point, and we're going to take that on board and we're going to do something different here rather than this is what you're being asked to do.
Yeah.
You just have to keep doing it.
Absolutely. So I'm thinking about, for those who are listening today, if you're wondering, like I have, what are some of the more appropriate cognitive assessments that we should be using with Aboriginal Australians? And my answer to you is there are some, I think they're like language, let me see here, like language screening measures that have been adapted for Aboriginal Australians and things, but just have a look online and just now have that permission, I think, to not just proceed with, the status quo and have a think, no, if I want to be an ethical and a competent practitioner here, I'm going to do my research and I'm going to find what measures are available and what assessments I can use, even to at least complement the ones that are available to me now that have been in use for many years with non-Aboriginal populations. And then I think maybe my hope is that with these new competencies and the code of conduct, this will now inspire the next round of assessments that are hopefully going to be more culturally appropriate for different cultures around the world. We're starting to shift our mindset away from what's traditionally been very white person dominated fields of practice and research. And we're now starting to I think expand our minds a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's so welcome and so important, and that it's actually written into these guidelines now. Because when I reflect back on that experience, I just think, wow, I actually didn't know what to do and I didn't have any guidance. And it's so important that we now, as you say, have this broader awareness, but also this broader responsibility, that we don't just accept the status quo, that we are able to look more broadly. And of course, over time, more is developed, and not every assessment is going to be suitable for every culture. So we may find that certain assessments will be relevant for one population and not for another. And that's our job too, is to be aware of what is suitable and what does the research say.
And so I guess talking about being culturally appropriate, like that might apply to working with refugees as well. So we might use adapted versions of worksheets and handouts and of screeners for screening symptoms as well. These are just some examples of the various ways that we can culturally adapt the assessments that we use with our consumers.
Yeah, and being aware of what's available and out there, absolutely.
Be aware that there is becoming many more assessments and screeners available. I know that there are a couple of, I wish I could say them off the top of my head. I didn't prepare them in time for this podcast, but there's in public health, in mental health, we're now being trained in a new Aboriginal mental health symptom measure. And it's, I haven't done that training yet, but some of my co-workers have, and it's really exciting to see. And they all came back from the training just really thrilled at being able to have a tool that's culturally appropriate to use for measuring mental health symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, another question I had about this competency number 4 was just around, does the board have an expectation? Just the way that this is worded made me question, are we required to remain competent in all of the cognitive assessments that we've been trained in our pathways of study as we progress into our careers and find our niches and that sort of thing? What's your opinion on this? Do we all need to stay up to date and across how to assess these?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. One of the things I remember learning very early in my career that has always stuck with me is that once you learn the principles of psychometric assessment, generally we can apply those principles to new assessments if we're required to learn them. So if we complete maybe training in personality assessment, for example, and we understand the process of administration and what's required and those factors that we need to consider, and then where there's obviously a scoring process and interpretation process, we can often take that information with a new assessment and we can open the manual and we've got a little bit of a framework to start working with. And we're obviously not going to be an expert in that new assessment, but it's going to give us a starting point.
I totally agree with that, Claire.
And so we are all trained in psychometric assessment and what's important there. So I think if we're getting rusty on those foundational principles, then that's probably time to begin to brush up on some of that. I do also think we have a responsibility to keep up to date with some of the latest measures that are available. So, for example, knowing that the WAIS-5 is going to be released in Australia soon, and that is going to be the latest edition of an adult cognitive assessment. It's one of several adult cognitive assessments. And having an idea of what cognitive assessment is, as in it's a standardized measure, and some of those principles of administration. Some of us may be trained in the whisk and the waist, some of us may be trained in the Stanford Binet, then we've got the Woodcock-Johnson, and we're not going to be experts in all of these. But having some knowledge and understanding of what it means to assess cognitive functioning and being able to interpret or read a written report that has been written and what that's going to mean, I do think is actually important for us to be aware of, in the same way that if a client is assessed for neurodivergence and they're provided with a diagnosis of autism and ADHD, and they present to us with a written report, that we are able to have some understanding of the measures that we used and how those measures have led to those conclusions, I do think is really important information for us to be across.
I must say, Claire, that was one of the things I really loved about becoming a supervisor, especially of 4+2s when that program was still open, because I was keeping across and up to date with all of the psychometric assessments. And I loved that. I thought, gee, I don't know if I would be keeping myself up to date with all of this in as much detail if I wasn't supervising students who needed my help with it. But no, so I guess what we're saying is that this competency 4 is saying that we do need to keep up with at least the latest information about the way that the assessments are being designed and how they're being normed and how to interpret the results of them at a minimum, I think. And like you said, we are always, once we've had that foundational training, we're always going to be able to, we should hopefully always be able to pick up a manual and refresh ourselves on the administration and interpretation of most psychometric assessments. And if we are finding that we're losing that confidence or that competence to be able to do that, then that would maybe be a sign that a refresher is needed.
And absolutely, because a refresher is going to be needed, and the extent to which a refresher is going to be needed, as in what extent are you going to immerse yourself in further learning, is going to depend on the need that you have for in the workplace, for example. So if you are needing to administer cognitive assessments, then you're going to want to get trained in those assessment tools, and you want to be across the administration so that you know that it's going to be administered in a standardized fashion.
I can see a fantastic mini online course. This could be a great idea for people like yourself, Claire, who are making courses. I would certainly be a person who would put my hand up to hear about the latest cognitive assessments, culturally adapted, appropriate cognitive assessments and symptom measures. I think that would be awesome.
I think we do owe it to our clients to know this information, but I also want to be clear that I don't think we need to all be experts. I don't think that if we're not doing these assessments on a day-to-day basis, then spending half of your PD allowance on learning one assessment may not be the most cost-effective and time-effective way of using up your professional development. So I think that we don't all need to learn how to use every single assessment tool, but we do need to know how to use the assessment tools that we are required to use, and we need to have a broad understanding of assessment in general.
Good. Thank you, Claire. Let's talk about risk in competency 4, because it's talking about now specifically how it's a requirement for us to safely and effectively assess risk. I don't know about you, but I definitely am of the opinion that it seems to be like a core skill that we're trained in from the very beginning and that's regularly applied in most workplaces and practices.
Risk assessment is included in the previous competencies because, as you're right, it has always been a requirement. It's something that we all need to be able to do. And I think if we have any doubt around this, then that is something that we really actually should be looking at really quite seriously, because this is something that could impact us all. And when we think about these competencies and why we are regulated health professionals, it is for the protection of the public. And so we owe it to our clients to keep them safe. And I do think that's a really important aspect of risk that may or may not be using particular psychometric measures, but it's likely to be using some kind of interview or some kind of clear process of questioning in order for us to get the information that we would need in order to make a valid assessment of risk.
Absolutely, yes. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh, I don't really do risk assessment much in my day-to-day practice, this is our message for you today to have a think about that and, yeah, find some resources to support you with that if needed.
Yeah, because it's definitely a clear part of competency, and it's a clear competency, I think, that's always been required of psychologists and health and mental health professionals.
What about this part about parental and family functioning? It's interesting. I don't remember that being included in the old version.
No, I don't remember that being there, but perhaps I'm thinking about understanding of like systemic issues.
Yeah.
And as in the family system. Of course, we've got other much broader systemic issues that can come into things as well that I think this code does address. But I think that probably has the capacity to potentially overlap with some of the risk as well. But sometimes and this is where I think potentially there's an overlap with working across the lifespan, because we might work with adults, but we may have adults who have young children. And of course, we've also got adults who may have been impacted by adverse experiences when they were younger children.
I was going to say all of the adults we work with have been children, and there have probably been some systemic features around what they've experienced. Absolutely. So I think it just comes down to this is understanding the context of family in presenting symptoms. That's something that we do often just with formulation. I think we're always taking into consideration the dynamics of the family system, even if we haven't had direct experience with understanding like family systems work. I think we do understand the dynamics there, but it's just really nice that they've included it there, and it's highlighting for us that consideration of parental and family function is made when we're working with our consumers, I think from the very beginning, from when we're doing our assessment of their own experiences growing up, and then also possibly ongoing stuff for them if we're working with children or if we're working with adults who have children.
And also, if we are working with children and families, of course, there will be that assessment likely of the young person who's presenting, but also potentially the parents and the wider family system, because of course that's going to impact. And so it does say administer a range of culturally safe assessment methods. So it's not necessarily just us administering psychometric assessment, but in terms of different methods that feel culturally safe.
So we could use like unstructured interview, just asking questions face to face or whatever method.
Yeah, and being aware of the factors that would form part of that assessment and the questions to ask and the information that would be needed for those assessments.
And lastly, before we finish, really interesting the inclusion of workplace assessments and performance assessments. This relates to the personality measures stuff that we were trained in our early career pathways of learning. Is that your understanding of it as well, Claire?
Yeah, I've actually had a little bit of experience working in organizational psychology when I did my internship and for a couple of years after my internship. So there were a number of assessments that we did use to administer, which included personality assessments, but also some aptitude assessments and abstract reasoning type assessments, but more designed for a professional population. So in terms of numerical or verbal reasoning or abstract reasoning. And I'm looking at this and thinking that this is actually encompassing all of the different areas of psychology, because of course organizational psychology is also it's its own area of endorsement, and we can do a master's purely in organizational psychology. And so it's great to actually see that included here, and just being aware again of the types of assessments that may or may not be relevant to particular populations. But I think my sense here is that it's probably including organisational psychologists, because so much of this is around clinical competency. But as an organisational psychologist, there would still be that need to be aware of risk and assess risk and be aware of a range of other assessment tools and interventions that may or may not be clinically applied. And so that's my sense as well, as it's included all of those different areas of psychology.
Very interesting. I didn't even consider the different types of postgrad programs that people can specialize in. So like you mentioned, organizational, there's counseling, psychology, educational, developmental psychologists. These competencies would apply to all of those, wouldn't they? So they've had to be quite broad.
Yeah, absolutely. When we think about performance measures, that might be sports and performance psychologists.
Incredible. I'm just having that epiphany now at the end of our 4th episode. Oh dear. Look, thank you so much for deep diving on these competencies. We've just covered competency number 4. Thank you everyone for listening. We're going to continue to cover the competencies, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, Isabelle. I really appreciate this discussion, and just the openness that we've been able to have here in nutting some of this out as well has been really, because we're just looking at these and familiarizing ourselves with these at this point.
We are, and we're just doing it with all of you.
We are.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. See you next time.
Thank you for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave us a 5-star rating. It really helps others find the show. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Between Two Psychs for more updates and resources. For more information and to explore everything we offer, head over to our website, betweentwopsychs.com.au. We appreciate your support, and we'll see you next time.